There are 8 main actions the forearm muscles perform. They flex the forearm, they supinate the forearm, they pronate the forearm, they flex and extend, and finally they deviate the wrist joint. So if you ever experience pain or discomfort in the elbow or wrist from performing any of these actions, training the forearms properly could be an important factor in making you more resilient. And finally, many of these muscles run all the way up into the hands and the fingers, so we can't neglect that in your workouts as well. So let's take a look at each of these in detail now. Flexing the forearm. Anytime you bend the elbow joint, you'll work the brachioradialis muscle. When you take a neutral or pronated grip, you'll bias it further as you place the biceps and forearm supinators into a weaker position. This is where any of your compound pulling motions like rows and chin-ups come into play, but for a targeted workout, we'd use hammer and reverse curl variations. Pronation and supination are 2 small but highly underrated and undertrained actions. This is the first area where a lot of people have gaps in their strength and workouts. Important points here are to try to isolate the motion at the elbow and the wrist instead of it letting it come from the shoulder instead. Cables, dowel rods and free weights are all great options that will provide slightly different resistance profiles or where in the range the exercise is most challenging. Wrist deviation is the next hugely overlooked function of the forearms. But if you want thick, well-balanced forearms that are functionally strong and robust, you need to pay attention to it. Anytime we're doing any fixed pressing or pulling, the wrist is overcoming these deviation forces to keep your wrist stacked evenly. But there'll also be times where it's necessary to go outside of this perfect stack, which is why it's important to train this action through a larger range of motion and build capacity through it. Extension and flexion of the wrist are the 2 most common movements we see in the gym for forearms, but there are a few additional options that you may not have seen in the past that have a ton of benefits. And of course, we can't forget the general gripping and holding exercises to build that grip strength.
Other arm or just one?
Just one.
Yeah.
We're good, man. We're good.
On that though, a question you may have is, are lifting straps cheating? If you want bigger forearms and a stronger grip, I believe lifting straps are incredibly important for training for 2 reasons. First, you don't ever want your grip to be the limiting factor on your leg or back days. And if you're doing a good amount of volume and intensity here, you will be limited by grip eventually. So instead of thinking of you having a weak grip if you need to use straps, I'd say you probably have a weak back or legs if you don't need to use straps eventually on things like Romanian deadlifts. The other reason is fatigue management. As you're about to see in the workouts, gripping only makes up one portion of forearm training. There's muscles and ranges of motion that you literally can't hit effectively by just gripping. But if you're so fatigued from all this indirect forearm work by not wearing straps, you won't be able to give them a solid effort when you need it in your direct forearm and grip workouts. You don't have to rely on them and use them all the time, but I would absolutely use a pair of straps. Now, if you need a pair, I've been making these leather ones for nearly 10 years now. I'm obviously biased, but they're incredibly comfortable and durable. There should already be a link up somewhere for you to grab them if you want to get a pair. Now that we understand the main muscles, movements, and exercises that we'll be working with, how do we fit this into a plan of reps and sets? There are 4 main categories that I use: max size, max strength, max endurance, and conditioning, or what would be called prehab, rehab, and general preparedness. Let's start with size, as it's probably the most familiar category. You just got to pick 1 or 2 exercises per action and train them for a full range of motion. Since we're working with a relatively small range of motion and smaller muscles, I like to work with slightly higher reps, around the 12 to 20 mark most of the time, as it's very easy to perform these movements incorrectly with heavier loads. But there will be some exercises where we absolutely can use a lower rep range. For max strength, I focus primarily on gripping exercises as a way to build and express your strength. The double overhand hold is my favorite for its simplicity and carryover to general lifting. But playing with different implements and grip positions are all options you can play with as well for this portion of your training. Instead of using reps and sets here, I program timed sets, aiming for sets between 5 to 15 seconds when looking at max strength. Load up as heavy as you can for the set duration, aim to accumulate a total of around 30 to 90 seconds of total work. Hanging can also be useful here, although I personally use hanging more on my endurance-based workouts.
That's hard. That's hard.
If you're wondering what software I'm using to build this is my baby Gambaru. I've been developing this app for over 5 years now as a complete training solution where you can get unlimited access to all of my programs and templates, a diet coach, a technique forum where you can upload videos for review, and an integrated workout log so you can track your progress. And I've also brought in all the mentors that I go to for advice in mobility, athleticism, strengths, calisthenics, and sports performance to deliver their programs through it as well. Scan this QR code here for a free trial and use the exclusive code Forearm at checkout for 30% off. And let's move on to forearm endurance. As the name suggests, endurance is not about how heavy a load you can pick up and hold, but extending the duration that you can hold it for. Hangs are my favorite option here, which primarily work the forearm flexors, but I also like to use the wrist roller to work the extensors at the back of the forearm. Similar to the max strength work, I like to use timed sets. The only difference here is the duration of the set, going from around 5 to 15 seconds up to 30 to 60 seconds, and taking the total volume up from 30 to 90 seconds up to 3 to 5 minutes. Finally, we have the general preparedness training. This is where I throw a lot of different conditioning drills that work to strengthen and mobilize the wrist and the hands and the fingers and the elbows. I usually sprinkle this sort of work in as warm-ups and finishes to my other workouts, and sometimes as their own specialized day if I find that I need a little bit of extra work on a weaker position. I get a lot of this stuff from gymnasts, hand balancers, and acrobats who are known for their incredible wrist and grip strength. But the rice bucket method, often used in martial arts, is probably the most underrated tool here. You just take a bucket, fill it with sand or rice, and dig your hands in. Next, anchor your forearm to stop you from cheating with the shoulder and back muscles, and perform rotations and reps of opening and closing your fingers. The rice provides resistance, and while it might not look like much, trust me, after about a minute of doing this, you're absolutely gonna feel it. Forearm's like, oh, pumped. Yeah. I also add in static strengthening work like reverse push-ups that lengthen and strengthen connective tissues around the wrists and extensor muscles, and direct finger training through fingertip push-ups and finger lifts. The reps and sets here will vary a little depending on the exercise that you choose, but again, I simply pick 1 or 2 of these movements to focus on at a time. As scientific and fancy as some of this stuff may sound, I also use this day to literally just scroll around on social media and find different exercises that could be fun to play with and throw them in. So I sometimes pick a random exercise and play around with it on this day, and then over time it might become a stronger feature in my training. So here is how everything might look across a full training week to specialize on your grip and forearms. 1 strength day, 1 hypertrophy day, 1 endurance day, and 1 general preparedness day, or you could sprinkle this in throughout the week. In terms of fitting into a plan, I'd try to avoid a lot of crossover with your upper body days that are quite grip intensive. So I'd either do your forearm and grip work at the end of these workouts, or I do them at the start of my leg days if I want it to be fresher. Just stick with the forearm workouts laid out in Gambaru and you'll be fine. Thank you all for sticking around to the end and watching this, and I'll see you in the next one.